Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Thanks to Adorama and for Fujifilm for arranging me to speak on one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, street photography. Um, we're just going to jump into it. So I'm just going to share my screen. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will respond to them after the presentation. So feel free to post in there. I may already answer some of the questions as part of my presentation here, but if there's anything that you feel like I left out, just go ahead and let me know. So I'm Ibarionex Perello. I am a photographer, a writer, educator, podcaster. But today I'm going to be talking to you about my photography, specifically my joy of street photography, because from the very earliest moments where I started making photographs, I was making photographs on the street. I learned photography. I live in Los Angeles, and I learned photography at the Boys Club of Hollywood. And when the counselors gave me a camera, put a roll of film in it, and I walked out into the streets of Hollywood and I started making my photographs. And from those early days, from those early moments, my relationship to photography has always been tethered to the street. There's something about of what happens out in public and what I'm able to create with photographs that has been sort of, you know, they've been permanently tethered together. And even though I practice other kinds of photography, in my heart, making photographs on the street or out in public is really at the heart of what I love to do. And there are a lot of people, including many of you, who are interested in street photography. Some of you have been toying with the idea of making street photographs. Some of you may have been doing it for a while already. But I get a lot of questions about people who are really interested in delving more into it. And one of the questions I've asked myself, and I often ask people who study with me, is, why do you want to do street photography? Because I think there are a lot of people who want to do street photography, and there's another group of people who need to do street photography. I'm part of the latter. I need to do that. I need to make those photographs out in the street. If I haven't been making them for a while, it's kind of like being hangry, where you're hungry and you're angry. You get very irritable. I'm not a good person to be around when I haven't shot in a while and I haven't had an opportunity to exercise that muscle. But there's a strong emotion for me that's tied to making images on the street. And I remember the very first moment that I made a photograph and I made a print and I shared it. One of the things that was very vivid for me was the reaction that it elicited from other people when they took a look at the photograph that I had made. And it was a photograph that was much better than I deserved to have made at that point. It was really well composed, well lit. The print is actually pretty damn good for someone who didn't know what the hell they were doing. But I remember that reaction, and it was one of the most affirming things I had ever experienced, because it was the first time that I had created something pretty much from whole cloth, and that I presented, and that people admired not just the photograph, but the way that I had seen the moment and captured it with the camera. And the idea that the way that I saw the world, the way that I saw a moment, and the way that I captured it could have the power to impact other people in that way was just intoxicating. And so I think that that's part of what has always driven me about making photographs is the discovery of going out there in the random chaos of the world and seeing a moment or seeing light or seeing a gesture and then pulling something out at 125th or 500th of a second and creating magic on a piece of paper when the image manifests itself as a print. And these are some of the photographers that have really influenced me. And I remember looking at these photographs, and these and other of these photographs, I looked at them in a sense of wonder, because I looked at those photographs, and up until to the point that I discovered their work, I didn't realize that that was possible with the camera. Because most of the pictures that I saw growing up were snapshots, family documents of birthdays and vacations and things like that. And then I slowly started discovering these photographers like Sam Abel, whose image of the calf branding you see here, William Albert Allard, another National Geographic photographer, photographing the Basque community in Europe. Gary Winogrand, photographing on the streets of Hollywood, the very strange streets that I used to walk up and down making photographs, or Joel Meyerowitz in New York City in Midtown. I looked at these photographs and I was just amazed by how these people saw the world and how they were able to translate that vision into a photograph. And I knew I wanted that for myself. I needed that for myself. And of course, because I didn't know a whole lot about photographs, I knew how to load a piece of film, a roll of film into a camera. I knew how to set exposure. But there were a lot of obstacles in my way, from being able to capture an image, to make an exposure, to be able to make a print from that image. And it was another thing to be able to make an effective photograph. And I think that that's an experience that anybody who's ever picked up a camera and who's decided to take to the streets finds themselves in. And now, in the age of YouTube, there's no shortage of of videos that are dedicated to the theme of street photography, and that's both a good and a bad thing, because I think understanding what street photography is, or what street photography can and should be for yourself, is very different than a lot of the content that's being put out there. A lot of people think that street photography is just taking pictures of strangers walking up and down the street, and it's so much more than that. Matt Stewart, who is a street photographer who many of you probably know, he's a great modern contemporary street photographer. He has this quote: "Street photography is an attitude, a state of mind, a way of being, rather than something that has to be done exclusively on the streets of cities." And the two things here. One of them is that street photography, especially for me, is a mindset. It's not shaped by what I photograph. It's not shaped by the lens that I use or the camera that I'm using. It is really about a mindset. It is, for me, a meditative practice, because my effectiveness as a street photographer, or any kind of photographer, but specifically street photography, is about being completely present and in the moment. That's the key. And that's something that I see in all the photographers that I've come to admire, both then and now. That photographers who are able to be thrown into a very chaotic moment where there's a whole bunch of stuff is happening, or even where nothing is happening, are present enough in the moment to be able to see the world in a very personal, unique, and different manner. And they pull the image out from that scene. And we'll talk about the sort of the technical side about street photography, but ultimately, all the technical stuff, all the lens choices, all the camera choices, how you process images, whether you use Photoshop or whether you use Capture One, or all that stuff, those are parts of facets of street photography. But ultimately, it's about your relationship to the moment. It's where are you in your head in the moment? Because otherwise, you're just snapping away and you're hoping for luck to give you something. And in order to be consistent in the street, it really comes down to your mindset. And the latter part about, the idea that street photography only happens on the street, that's not the case. Because I think Matt has another definition of street photography as being public photography. That anywhere that you're in public, anywhere where people are, existing and living and interacting with strangers, that's ripe for street photography. You look at Robert Frank's The Americans, seminal book on photography, which arguably is street photography. And some of those images were made in bars, in an elevator car. And for me, in terms of my opinion, those are just as valid as street photographs as anything that may have been made on Broadway in New York or the Champs-Élysées in Paris. It's not so much where you make the photograph or what kind of lens you make the photograph with, but how you're seeing the world and how you are deciding to compose all those elements within the frame. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things that I think stand in the way of a lot of people being able to do this effectively. Because I'm going to make the assumption that you've at least made the effort to go out and make photographs on the street. And while you may have made some good images every once in a while, you're really aspiring to do much more with your photography. That you want to get better as a street photographer, or you want to be able to do something that sort of reflects what you're seeing some of the better street photographers do or have done in the past. So the one thing and I'm going to be speaking for myself as much as I am to you, because this is stuff that I have to process on my own. But I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is a big obstacle between me and my effectiveness as a photographer is making things too complicated. So there are a couple of points I want to make on that. So the first one is this idea of carrying too much crap. Now, when I first came up as a photographer, and especially as I started getting money, I started buying a lot of stuff. I'd have two bodies. I had a donkey bag with about 3 or 4 lenses, a flash unit, rolls of film, and I'd throw this thing over my shoulder, and I would go out and I would see scenes, and I would be going between the two cameras and switching lenses, and and that worked for me back then. But I think I know better now, because I know that having all that equipment with me and having all those choices in the bag didn't equate to me making better photographs. One of the things that I encourage anybody who is a street photographer is to carry just one camera, one lens. And I say that for a variety of different reasons. One of them is you keep things simple. If you don't have to think about switching a lens and going from a 28 or going to an 85 or a 16 to a 50, that moment where you're switching lenses and you're thinking about the camera and the equipment takes you out of the moment. You're thinking about the gear when you should be paying attention to what's playing out in front of you, because the street is constantly changing. It's constantly in flux. And that's where your attention needs to be. And if you have too much equipment, it gets distracting. It pulls you out of it. I own a variety of different Fujifilm cameras. I used to work for magazines, so I used to write about all the equipment. So I've shot with Nikon, I shot with Olympus, I've shot with Canon, Leica, and and for me ultimately the choice of camera is like, which one do I like to work with? Which one fits the way that I see and I shoot? And when I was introduced to the X100 series, it was an X100S, and I was going to Paris for the very first time. And I borrowed a camera from a friend of mine. And that camera was a revelation to me. Not because it had amazing autofocus or an amazing sensor. There was a simplification that happened with that built-in lens in there, and the traditional controls and for shutter speed and aperture. And I suddenly realized as I used that camera for those 2 weeks how much I had been reducing my effectiveness by having too much on me, and by being limited to pretty much a 35 millimeter field of view. I had to see the world and the potential for photographs through the field of that lens, that field of view. And it wasn't stifling, it was liberating. And I found myself making photographs that I wasn't making with my DSLR, with my trinity of zoom lenses. And there was just, I kind of rediscovered that joy that I had making photographs. And I have an X100F. I don't have the V. I had the S, and then eventually I upgraded to the F. But I also have an X Pro 3, which is kind of in line with the aesthetics of the 100 series, but I have the opportunity to change lenses. And right now I'm using the 33 on the X Pro, and playing a little with using wide apertures and using that combination of mechanical and electronic shutter. Normally, when I go out and shoot with my settings, I set my ISO for about 400. I set my aperture to 5.6. I center my AF point, and I'm in aperture priority. And usually my shutter speed is at least 250th of a second. And the idea of setting my camera even before I've walked out of the door is that if I'm getting out of my car or getting out of the subway station or come upon a scene that I go, oh, that's a great photograph, I can immediately raise my camera to my eye and take the picture. Because with that ISO and with that aperture, with a good amount of light, whether I'm in open shade or in direct sunlight, I know I can get a sharp enough photograph with enough depth of field and a fast enough shutter speed that even if I bring the camera up abruptly, the shutter speed will counter any sort of camera shake. If I go indoors, then I know that, okay, what I need to change even before I discover the scene. Open up my aperture, increase my ISO, look at what my shutter speed is, make any adjustments, and start seeing. I'm not preoccupied with a bunch of the special settings of the camera unless there's a specific need for it. So I think that keeping it simple is really important. And the other reason I think that it's important to work with a single lens, and by single lens I'm talking about a fixed focal length, is I think it's important to commit to a focal length for a period of time. When I was shooting film and I was in college, I had a 35 millimeter f4 on my Nikon camera, and I used that lens pretty much exclusively, or at least 80%, for about seven years, even after I got out of college. And I knew the world through that 35 millimeter lens. I could see a scene and frame it without even bringing the camera to my eye, because I had made so many photographs with that 35 millimeter focal length that I could look at a scene and assess it and then bring the camera to my eye and refine the composition and the framing. And That's really important to do, because if you're able to do that, if you own that focal length to the degree that you can look at a scene with your naked eye and have a sense of how you would frame it, that's one last thing you have to think about when you're out there making photographs. The less you have to think about your camera, the better. But the only way you can get there is by getting so adept with the camera, with how to change aperture or white balance or exposure compensation, to the point you don't even have to look at it. That when you get to that level with the camera, you're focused on the moment. You know exactly what you need to do to change exposure compensation. You may not even have to look at the dial. You just go click, 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 and you know that you've adjusted it up or down a full stop. You know, people who change up cameras on a regular basis, I I I I can't understand. It's unimaginable to me that they master the camera, because I remember when I went from the X100S to the F, my first week with the camera, I struggled with it because there was a very slight difference in the shutter delay between pressing the button and actually taking the picture. And I had gotten so in sync with that X100S that I knew exactly when I had to fully depress the button when the picture would actually be made. And when I got the F, it was different. And I was missing shots. And it took me a while to get adjusted to that. Um, if you don't know your camera that well, then you have to work on it. You know, even if you're in your office in your home playing with that camera, and you know what settings you need to change. You primarily need to change your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, your white balance, and your focus. Those are the essential things you need to understand, and you need to be able to make those decisions in a quick second. Now, the other idea about going out with street photography is that because the world is so chaotic, because there's so much going on, it can be overwhelming. It's like when you go on vacation, right? You go to a city you've never been to before. Everything looks amazing. Everything looks wonderful. And you're just sort of snapping away. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're really making effective photographs. Yeah, you're making photographs, some of which may be very pleasing, but I'm talking about making an effective photograph in which you're leveraging line and shape and color and light and shadow and making a composition that's really effective. And rather than just going out there and thinking, well, whatever sort of pops up, I'm just going to shoot. I think it's important to go out there with a focus, especially if you're trying to develop a way of seeing the world. Like, for example, I shot this in Italy in 2012, and this was a early period, recently relative period, where I was really looking not only to play with light and shadow, but incorporating color and gesture. I was taking all these disparate elements that I had come to sort of recognize that make a good photograph, and looking to find ways to make compositions that put them all together, not just focused on a singular thing going, oh, that's interesting light or that's interesting line. Because while those images might be very pleasing on that particular aspect, it didn't mean that that quality alone was resulting in a good photograph, right? It was being able to see those multiple things and somehow combine them and effectively make the image. And so one of a lot of things that I was just recently going through the images that I made in Italy, and I was looking at the photographs, most of which were abject failures. But I saw what I was going for, because this image is probably one of the better images that reflect that sensitivity to light, to shadow, to line and shape, and the color and the gesture. All of those things are things that I try to incorporate in a photograph, in a composition. And of the hundreds or thousands of photographs that I made during that trip, this was one of the closest ones that got to that moment. And when I looked at it, it was like, oh, I'm getting it. But I purposely went out looking for the play of light and shadow. Fan Ho, who is a famous Japanese photographer from the 50s, who's been emulated by so many street photographers, was really effective in using this thing of light and shadow. And even though he was using cameras in the 50s with a very limited depth of field, a limited ISO range, nothing like the cameras that we have now. But he saw the world in a really beautiful and unique way that really sort of transformed the landscape of photography, not only in Japan, but everywhere in the world, to anyone who's ever discovered those images. But for me, this exploration of light and shadow became the thing that I focused on when I went out to shoot. And whether it was twilight hour or the middle of the day, I would walk wherever I was and I'd be looking for light and shadow and seeing, oh, there it is. What else is there? Because that always became the starting point. If I'm walking down the street and one side is in shade and the other one is brightly lit by sunlight, I'm going to go to the sunny lit side of the street. And I'm going to look for a pocket, a space where light is a budding shadow. And then I'm going to start looking, what else is here? Are there lines? Are there shapes? Are there people moving through the scene? How can I start taking these disparate pieces and put them together into a scene? And sometimes I have all the elements like I did here, but it needed something. It needed a human figure coming there. And when I looked at I made about 12 or 15 images in this space of different people walking or bicycling through the scene, most of which failed. And then I have this one picture, which I think was really effective of what I was trying to go for. Now, the other thing that I had to sort of understand about going out and making street photographs is that every time I go out there, this is about practice. In my early days, I would go out, I would spend 3 or 4 hours making photographs. And either when I got back the proof sheet or I downloaded the images to my computer, I would look at them and I would get frustrated if I had a day where I felt like I wasn't successful, where I felt like all the pictures were crap. And that was a mistake because I was making the goal, trying to make a great photograph, trying to make exceptional photographs. Not just one, I was trying to make 3 or 4 or 5 great photographs. And if I felt short of that mark, I felt like it was a waste of time. I felt like, God, I don't have any talent, or, why can't I do this? It became a frustrating thing. Something that began as something that began with so much joy was being weighted down by this unreasonable expectation of what it should be. And I had to make the switch to understand that when I go out there, it's always practice. Whether I shoot 7 images that day, 70 or 700, it is always practice. Because the majority of images that I will make in any given day or any shooting session, most of them will not work. There may be 1 or 2 that are like fantastic, but a lot of them are good, but they aren't necessarily great. But that doesn't matter, because when I go out and shoot, I have one goal, and that is to make at least one photograph that is the kind of photograph I would not have made before. And if you've been shooting for a while, you'll understand the statement that one of the perils of being a good photographer is that there are certain images that you can do well. And you'll get into the trap of making that same picture over and over and over and over again. And if you're like me, at some point, that's going to get very frustrating. Because you're looking at other people's work and you're going, why isn't my work like that? And that's one of the things that I had to sort of refocus rather than punishing myself because I didn't make that exceptional photograph. The goal became, okay, let me make at least one photograph that even if it isn't completely successful, that I see a hint of something in that picture that tells me, oh, I'm getting closer. I can look at that picture, take it apart and go, this is why it works. This is why it doesn't work. And learn from it. Because I learn more from my bad photographs than I do my good ones. Like for this image here, this was in Paris, overlooking the street below the balcony at our hotel. It had just rained. And I saw the street. I saw the lines, the shapes. And just from all the times that I had been shooting, I could see the potential of that scene for something interesting. Because graphically, it was a great backdrop that it provided me. But I knew that I needed figures moving through the scene. But I also knew from experience that I wanted more than one person in the frame. Because I knew I had made pictures that kind of like this, where there's a street scene and you have somebody, say, with a single umbrella or wearing a red coat walking through it. I had done that often enough that I knew that I could be good at doing that. This, for me, the challenge I presented to myself on this day is like, how many people can I get in the frame and still make the image work? So as I overlooked it, I framed the composition and I just stayed there and observed as different people walk through the scene. And I was there for about a half an hour, making picture after picture, because I could see people walking up or down the street or down the crosswalk. And I could anticipate when people were coming through, and man, there were times where I was just like, please cross the street now. Because I was looking for, okay, someone's coming from the left, someone's coming from the right, someone's coming down the street. Oh, and I'm hoping that they enter the frame at about the same moment. And most of the time it just didn't happen. I still made the picture, right? Because it was about me getting into the rhythm and timing. And when this moment finally happened, where I had the three people with the umbrella and the one woman about to cross the street, it was like what I'd been hoping for, right? But the only reason I just didn't make that single picture with just the single person walking through the frame is because I was aspiring to do something that I knew was more difficult for me. That the risk of failure was really high because I was striving for something that wasn't easy for me at that point. Because I could certainly have just waited for one person to walk into that frame, and it would have been a fine shot because the overall scene, the backdrop, is so graphic. One person wearing a colorful coat would have made an interesting image, but I wanted more from that, and I pushed myself to stick around and just make the photographs. And this image is satisfying, not just because I think it's an effective composition, but because I stuck to it, that I didn't give up prematurely and go, it's not going to happen. I said, I'm sticking with this. I'm sticking with this. And it paid off. Now, this is one of the biggest things that you'll hear me saying in my workshops is just slow the F down. It's one of the biggest problems for anyone sort of working on the street for a variety of different reasons. The tendency is to feel like you have to constantly be moving. There are two types of street photographers. There are the people who fish and the people who was I can't believe I'm forgetting. Well, there's one where people are constantly moving up and down the street, snapping away, and there are other people who will just kind of find a scene and they will allow it to sort of play out. I kind of do both. I tend more towards fishing than I do to the other approach, but in both cases, it is really important not to be in a rush. If I come upon a scene where I think it has some potential, I will try and work that scene, until something changes where I think the lights change and all of a sudden, okay, what drew me to the scene is gone. Or I'll make sure that I take more than one photograph, like the image I showed you before. I just didn't make one photograph. I committed and I made photograph after photograph after photograph, not absently, right? Being very observant, being very present, making pictures and observing how things are changing, right? Or one of the other things that I see a lot of photographers doing is not making enough pictures. They'll see a scene, they'll make a couple of photographs, they'll look at their back, the LCD, and they move on. And they don't have a great photograph there. They have some elements of what could make a good photograph, but because they're not seeing, they're not looking carefully, they're just getting a gist of something. They take a picture, they see that what was in front of them they've captured, they've gotten a nice snapshot of the scene, and then they move on. And I can't tell you how many times in a workshop I'm going through, because when I do my workshops, they show me everything. I download every frame that they've made and I go through it because I'm as interested in the picture, the ultimate picture that they made, and everything that led up to it. And sometimes I'll see people who've made like one or two photographs and I'm going, why'd you stop? This thing could have played out really wonderfully if, look where the light is. If you had someone move into the light, if you had shifted the camera ever slightly to the left, you were eliminated this distraction in the upper right-hand corner. But because they're thinking, oh, I might miss that next great shot around the corner, I need to hurry up and get this. And let me tell you, you're going to miss a lot. You're going to miss most of what's happening out there, right? Don't keep thinking that the best shot is right around the corner, right? If something is stopping you and drawing your attention in that moment, there's a reason for it. Even if you don't completely understand why it is, your job as a photographer is to try and figure it out. And you may not succeed. You may take 30 pictures of that scene and come back and go, it just didn't work. But you still work it to the best of your ability. You try to figure out in the moment, how can I make this better? And then later when you pull up the images on the computer and you look at them, you assess it again and go, why didn't it succeed? Oh, in this frame, I had this person come in here, and if I'd waited a couple of beats and they moved into this part of the frame, it would have balanced the composition a little better. Okay? If you don't immerse yourself in the moment won't reward you. If you just react and snap without any thought as to how you're seeing and how things are playing out in front of you, you may get lucky and make a good photograph every once in a while, but you're in no way going to be consistent, and you're going to be more reliant on luck than anything else. And the other thing about rushing is this whole issue of settings. I talked earlier about being completely familiar with the camera, it being an extension of your eye and your hand and your arm and your head and your heart, all of it. But if you're not aware where you are, what happens, and it's happened to me countless times, which is why I preset my camera to walk out the door. I'll walk out, I have my camera with me all the time, every day. I'm not without my camera. And I'll see a scene and I'll take a picture, and all of a sudden it sounds like, man, that shutter speed was kind of slow. And I realized that, oh crap, I was shooting some stuff on another day and the shutter speed is at a third of a second, it's 15th of a second, and the aperture is wrong, or the ISO is wrong, or the autofocus point is on the upper right-hand corner rather than the center of the frame. And this moment that I thought was just going to be great, I look at the screen or I pull it up on the computer and I realize, crap, I forgot to reset the camera. And this image that I thought was wonderful is gone. And if you're rushing, you're going to find out these mistakes when it's too late. if I'm on a street corner and I make an image and I've adjusted my aperture or my ISO, say I've walked into an area of shade, I'm going to look at what my shutter speed is. And if it's a 1/25th of a second, I'm either going to open up my aperture or I'm going to increase my ISO so that I can get a more reasonable shutter speed of about 250th of a second or higher if I want to make things tack sharp. But once I've done that, I'm going to reset everything to ISO 400, aperture 5.6, my AF point in the middle, and if I've changed my white balance, I'll change that. Those are the only things that I typically change. But I always reset after a scene is played out. This was for a Martin Luther King parade that happens every year near me, and I usually go before the parade to make images. And these little cheerleaders, young cheerleaders, were practicing before the parade, and I saw this scene, and I'd already had my camera set for the light because it was like early morning. It was probably around 8:30 in the morning, so the light wasn't really high. You can see some of the long shadows that are on the grass, but I saw this scene. And my camera was already set so that I had a really reasonably fast shutter speed and that aperture. So as I went towards the scene, I looked through the viewfinder just to see that my shutter speed and my aperture were where I wanted it to be. And I composed this image purposely with the coach in the center of the frame because the word coach was on her pants, right? Establishing who she was relative to everybody else. And the one thing that I needed to do here, the change I needed to make in order to make this photograph effective, was to shift my focus point from the center to the left to focus on the girl who's on the left-hand side. Because otherwise the focus would have been on the coach and the girls in the background would have been out of focus. That was the only thing technically that I needed to change. And once I did that, I was able to dedicate my time to paying attention to what was happening with the girls as they practice. I didn't have to look at any of my settings anymore. I just looked at the moment as it was playing out. And I made multiple photographs as the different reactions. And I just love this shot of her with her kicking up in the air, her tongue sticking out, the repetition of red, the play of dark, the blacks and the reds and the blues. And it's just like, great. But the only thing I had to think about is like, change my AF point and I'm back in the moment, right? If you're having to think about all these different settings on your camera, you're going to miss moments like this because you're too focused on your camera. Or if you're switching lenses, you're going to lose the moment because you're preoccupied with that. Now, this is probably like the death knell, along with rushing. And this is probably tied to rushing. Is this impatience and tendency to distraction? Some people do not like standing in one place and letting things play out. They prefer to like constantly be moving like a shark, and pulling out images from the scene, which is fine. I completely get that there may be a preference to sort of shoot that way, right? But it still requires a degree of patience, right? Because you can't make things happen. You are in no control of how the light moves through the scene, where people choose to make a left or a right or any of that stuff. You have no control over it. And sometimes you have to just say, I'm just in the moment and I'm just going to see how these things are going to come together and anticipate what might happen. Go, well, if this person walks here and this person walks in this direction and they cross where this light is, then I could make a shot and let me compose it so that when that happens, I can make the image. And then when that doesn't happen, it's like, okay, let me see. Is anybody else coming? Is there another potential? Okay, let me just stay here for a while and not constantly make the shot, look at it, go, oh crap, that didn't work. I'm going to move on to something else. If you sense that there's potential for something, try to make it work. Right? And the other one is just distraction. I do not listen to music when I'm going up and down the street. I rarely shoot with other people. There are only one or two photographers that I go out with on occasion, and we all understand each other. You know, it's not a social activity. We'll go out. We'll go okay, and we'll go out in downtown Los Angeles or Venice or Hollywood, and we will periodically cross paths with each other, right? Because we all know that if we're like in a pack, we're going to distract each other. You know, we're going to see them making a photograph of something, and we're going to be preoccupied with what they're seeing or how they're seeing it and trying to figure that out rather than being focused on myself. I'll get to see their pictures later. Right now, I'm here to do this for me, to make my own photographs. Like this photograph here is a really perfect example of that idea of not being distracted and having patience. I went to sort of like a Comic-Con convention that was happening in downtown Los Angeles, and we were leaving, and we were several blocks away from where we had parked our car, and I saw this person who was in this costume, and at the street where I saw them, I made a photograph, but it wasn't a good photograph just because the overall framing in the scene just didn't work. But we were both walking in the same direction, and rather than thinking it was just fixating on the fact that I just made a bad shot of this thing, of this person, I just continued walking, and for about 3 blocks. And at the next block, I saw this shaft of light cutting through this parking lot, and I saw the ATM machine. I saw the yellow posts, and I knew that this person was going to walk through that light. And by this time, there had been the distance between me and them had increased, and so I started running, right, to get myself in the position where I knew I could make the composition, right? Because I think this was with like a 35 millimeter focal length, so I kind of knew. So by the time I got to them, I didn't have a whole lot of time to sort of figure out the position. I just knew that the moment that they entered the light was when I needed to make the photograph. So, you know, when they entered the light, I was able to make probably I think I only had 2 frames out of it, right? But even though I was with other people, you know, my wife and some other friends who had attended this event, I was still present. You know, I was still actively seeing, evaluating what was playing out in front of me. And so when I saw the potential for the scene, and I assessed what needed to happen in terms of my relative position to him and his position to the light and to the background, I calculated all those things, made those decisions, and moved into the scene. Yeah. Other thing, potential isn't a good photo. And if you're with other photographers, you've probably heard this. They're sharing pictures and go, "Oh, this is a picture. It would have been better if this happened, or if this guy had got come into the light." This is, you know what I'm talking about. You know, people who start explaining to you a picture that they made that could have been better, and that's a lesson. That isn't a good photograph, right? And if you recognize the potential for that, why didn't you stick around, right? To try and make it better. Why didn't you make different choices? Why didn't you go from horizontal to vertical? Why didn't you step back? Why didn't you get closer? Why didn't you underexpose? Why didn't you change your focus point from this to that? Right? You have to completely own the photograph. You have to own the moment that you're making the photograph. You have to own the moment when you're evaluating the photograph, when you're looking through it on your computer or your laptop. You know, you're going to miss a lot of shots. That just comes with the territory. But you never want to look at a picture and go, man, if I had done this, it would have been a better shot. If you already knew that. It's one thing to look at it and later learn that, oh, this would have made this an effective photograph. And now I know going forward, I have to make this choice. But if you already know better and you still don't make the choice in the moment because you're rushing or you're distracting, that's your own damn fault, right? There's nobody with a gun to your head when you're out there making images on the street. The only one putting pressure on you is you. So if you're making the choice to go out there for 15 minutes or for 3 hours or however long you're making photographs, man, you got to own it. You got to own it. And you got to work it to the best of your ability. Don't worry about whether or not it's going to be great or successful. That's not the point. The point is to commit to that moment, whether it's a couple of seconds or 3 minutes. Like this image I made in Italy. Again, I was playing with line and shape and color in a way that I hadn't really done before. And I saw this repetition, the line, the shape, the color. And I looked at the scene and I go, yeah, I got the composition, but I need something. And I saw this boardwalk there and this guy walked through the frame in there. I was like, oh, that's it. And I can't tell you that I saw the shadow he was casting on the boardwalk. I was paying more attention to the display of his legs as he moves through the scene because I already knew where in the frame I needed somebody. It was only later that I picked up that the shadow on the boardwalk was there, and it was like, oh, even better, right? But if I had just taken the scene in that very moment where I first encountered it, it wouldn't have been as effective a photograph. I might have all the elements here, but if I didn't have that figure there, the shot would be a very different shot, and I don't think it would be as effective. There's this concept that I talked about feeding the beast. And anytime you have a moment of decision on the street, you usually have a choice, right? Say, for example, a lot of people are very reticent to photograph strangers. And if you're on the street, and I'm not talking approaching people to ask them to make their portrait, I'm talking about making a street photograph that includes a stranger in the composition. And some people may see the potential for a good street photograph and they'll hesitate to make the photograph. And in that moment, this fear comes up because you're fearing confrontation. You don't want to be seen as a creep. You don't want to make anybody angry. You don't want anybody to hit you. Whatever it is, but there's this moment of hesitation between making the photograph and not making the photograph. And in that choice comes the concept of the beast, of which you feed. In that moment, you either decide to make the picture or you don't make the picture. And I'm not saying that either is right or wrong, but if each time you make the choice to make the photograph, you are training yourself that making the photograph is what I'm here to do. And I'm going to build that muscle of when I feel that fear and feel that anxiety, I'm going to make the picture. And that I'll deal with whatever happens afterwards. I'll deal with it. Or I feel the fear, I feel the anxiety, and I don't take the photograph. So that's the reaction. And each time that happens, one of the things is the one that you're going to make stronger. That's the beast you're feeding. So if you repeatedly go out there, and more often than not, you're choosing not to make the photograph, that's the behavior you're reinforcing in your mind. And you're going to be struggling with this. And if you have this inclination to do it over and over and over again, and you keep saying no to yourself, it becomes all the harder to make the photograph, right? And this is not to say that I always make the photograph. There's sometimes I can't get past the fear, the anxiety, and I don't make it. Okay, but more often than not, I do. Because for me, making the photograph is so important, and I'm not doing anything wrong. And I rarely after, God, over 40 years of making pictures, have had, maybe 2 or 3 confrontations that no one's ever tried to hit me. Some people have yelled at me, confronted me about it, but it was like I just explained what I was doing, being genuine and honest. And if they wanted me to delete the picture, which only happened like once, I said, fine, I'll delete the picture, because it was just like, I don't want to ruin anybody's day. Right. But I'm really genuine when I'm out in the street and they go, why am I making a picture? I'll explain the light and you and the scene. And, I'm very enthusiastic about it. Right. But anytime that comes up, you have to realize that you're making a choice between 2 reactions to that moment. And one of the things that's really important about that concept is that if you go out there making on the street and you're preoccupied with the potential of having a conflict with someone because you're out there making images on the street, you've set yourself up for failure. You're more than likely going to be saying no to yourself and not taking the photograph over and over and over again because you're just so nervous about that. And that takes you out of the moment, right? Give up on that, especially if it hasn't presented itself yet. Because what you want to do is you want to remain present in the moment. You want to be looking at everything that's playing out around you, seeing the scene, seeing how light's changing, how the very street itself is evolving, the moment is evolving, and there's a crescendo and there's a denouement, and all of those things. That's what you want to be playing out and focusing on. And if you're distracted by the potential for something to go wrong, you are not in the moment. There's a scene that I photographed in Beverly Hills, or it was West Los Angeles, and it was late afternoon, and I saw this play of light, and I was like, oh, this light is so gorgeous. And I said, oh, let me try and do something with this intersection there, because I was like, part of my thinking was maybe I should go down the street because there's not a whole lot here. And I was like, screw it, I'm just going to stay here. And different people came to this intersection, and I was making a myriad of different shots, and most of the stuff wasn't working. And this person with this dog had come once and passed through, and it wasn't a good photograph, and they walked past, but they came back, and they were walking back in the direction they had come, and they stopped at the corner waiting for the light, and I saw them there, and then I saw the bicyclist coming, and I realized he was going to ride the bike onto the sidewalk. And I was already aware of what was happening with the shadows because I had been there already for 10 minutes evaluating the light. So I knew there was these long shadows that were coming. So I knew, okay, let me take a couple of steps back, because I was using like a 28 millimeter lens. And when the bicyclist came out onto the scene, I made the shot. And then it has that, it has light and shadow, it has line and shape, it has color, it has gesture, it has all those elements in there that I like to see in my photographs, right? I was there. If one of these people didn't like me, making the photograph, I couldn't be preoccupied with that. I was like, man, there's a moment that's about to play out. I need to make the picture. And if there's anything that happens after that, I'm just going to have to deal with it. But I just know that I have to do this. So, this fear leads you to a choice. And you have to understand that if you're doing public photography, that the fear is something that you have to overcome. Because if you can't overcome it, you're not long for this kind of photography. You're going to make yourself miserable trying to practice this kind of photography. And from my experience, in a lot of street photographers I know, unless you're going up to somebody with a 16 millimeter lens and a flash and popping, flash, in their face, the likelihood that you're going to have any sort of violent confrontation is like slim to none. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but for the great majority of my experience and for other street photographers I know, most of the time it's just like, if someone's offended, apologizing, explaining what you do, and then sort of moving on. But the potential for that is not going to stop me from making the photographs, because like I said at the beginning of this presentation, I need to make the photographs. I have to make the photographs. I can't stop making these photographs. And so I'll keep doing it. I was making this photograph in Santa Monica, and this guy was helping with his girlfriend, practicing these moves on these parallel bars. And I could see from the corner of my eye that he did not like me taking pictures of his girlfriend. I guess he thought I was some sort of perv or something. But that's not what it was about. I saw the scene, and I saw the lines and the shapes, and I knew that this would make a great black and white photograph, and I carefully framed the shot to include the boy looking up at her, paying attention to the horizon line, and then looking and observing what the changes in her body. And when she extended her right leg straight parallel to the bars, it's like I made that photograph, and it was like, yes. And I didn't go up to them afterwards or anything like that. I kind of made my photographs and I moved on. But there was that moment where I sensed that the guy was not happy with me being there. But I was like, I have to make the photograph, and I did. So all this, sort of builds to this idea that you have to spend time looking. You have to start looking and stop watching. And I mean this in different ways. Just because you're looking at something doesn't mean you're seeing something. You may have heard that. But looking and seeing, by that I mean is that you are observing it, and you're paying attention, and you're not just sort of watching it and not carefully observing the different pieces that make up a scene. And by this, I also mean, stop watching YouTube videos of other people doing street photography, because that's not going to teach you how to look and see. But that's a tangent. I won't dive too deeply into that. But there's an idea about looking carefully, about looking and experiencing the moment. And I don't know if there's one word that sort of encapsulates that. But that's really the trick for me. I'm looking at it, but I'm experiencing. Watching is sort of a passive activity, right? You're at home, you're watching a movie, you're on your phone or your tablet, you're going sort of back and forth. You're not really looking at the movie. It's there. You're watching it periodically, but you're distracted. You're not present. You can't do that on the street. You have to be looking and present in the moment, because the greatest photographs, street photographs, the great photographs, are often propelled from good to great because of the smallest of gestures, because of the smallest of changes. And if you're not observing that carefully, you're going to miss it. You're not going to see it. You're not going to anticipate it. You may get it out of sheer luck, but you're not spending all this equipment. You're spending all this money on equipment, spending these endless hours consuming videos and books and magazines, just to simply rely on luck to see you through this. This scene in Japan, we were waiting for an Uber in Tokyo, and I saw this scene, and I'm talking about the corner, the crosswalk, the mural, the post. I saw all of that and go, that's really interesting. Really interesting just graphically. And as we were waiting for the Uber, I kept my head in that direction. And then this scene came together. And none of this could I have planned, right? None of it. But I had trusted that instinct where I saw the potential for the setting to provide me an interesting composition. And by not getting distracted by conversing with the other people that I was with, we were going to catch the Uber with, and getting caught in the conversation or getting on my phone, I kept my head over here looking at this, and I knew that at some point the car was going to come and I'd have to leave. But until then, I was like, let me see what happens here. And this happens, where I have these 5 figures come to the scene, kind of similar to that shot in Paris where I shot overhead with the umbrellas. And there's this convergence of people moving into the scene, and this one woman sort of running through the middle. And I just love how all these 4 people at the perimeter of the frame help guide your eye to the woman, and the way her hand and her feet sort of run through the scene. I love the shot, not just because of the way it looks, but because I trusted my instincts. I saw the potential for a scene. I continued to pay attention, and as things started changing, I started observing and figured out, okay, when do I press the shutter release button? And then within a couple of minutes, the Uber was there and I was gone. Right? It was, and I was in a foreign country. I don't speak Japanese. My host spoke Japanese, but I couldn't be preoccupied with any of that stuff. It's like I saw the potential, and I go, I got to try. I got to see what make the picture, and I did. The other thing that's been really important in terms of my development as a photographer is nurturing my eye, training myself to see. Like many of you, I'm on Instagram. I look at a lot of people's pictures. I watch probably way too many YouTube videos. But the way I sort of honed my teeth was looking at the work of photographers whose work just I was in love with, that I looked at and I just went, how the hell did they do that? And for me, you probably cannot see my library of monographs behind me, but that's been my photo education, is monographs, photo books, not instructional books, but photographs dedicated to individual photographer who's produced a body of work. One of the seminal photographers for me is Bill Allard, famous National Geographic photographer. And I bought this book in college, and it still has the original receipt in the book. And my edition is well worn and dog-eared, because I went through that book over and over and over and over again. Because I didn't know, when I saw his pictures, I didn't think what he did was possible. Because he was working for National Geographic, so he was working with color slide, and working with relatively low ISOs. There was Kodachrome 25, 64, 200 around that period of time. So not the kind of latitude that we have with the current cameras. And he would photograph under lighting conditions that that at the time I thought was impossible. So how can he shoot with Kodachrome 64 and shoot in a place where there's virtually no light? And he would make it work. And I just marveled at his sense of color. And I looked at those pictures, and it was unfathomable to me that I could make those kind of photographs at that time. But I knew I wanted to. And looking at his photographs, I deciphered why does it resonate with me? Why does it sing to me? And how do I think I would make that photograph, right? Because it wasn't about the exotic locations, whether he was in Spain or whether he was in Peru, or that wasn't what was making the photographs mean something to me. It was the way that he was seeing the world and how he was using color and light that amazed me. Another seminal book is, and this former book, it's out of print, but when I looked yesterday, you can still get it on eBay for a reasonable price. So I highly recommend it. It's a lot of essays in there. It's not just dedicated, but I think the content in here was life-changing for me. The Americans, seminal book on by Robert Frank, and I think every photographer should own this book, and it's been reprinted multiple times, so you have no problem for finding this book, you know. But yes, these books are amazing. They're as amazing now as they were then when they were made. And one of the things you want to do when you look at these book, when you look at this book and you look at however number of images are in it, and you think about, oh, how great these photographs were. Robert Frank, I don't know how many tens of thousands of frames he made. Only a few of them ended up being in this book that completely transformed the trajectory of photography. Yes, it's sort of documentary, but street photography can often be seen as a derivative of street photography. So it's sort of part and parcel, sort of the same. But if you're only going to get one book, this book is, I think, the kind of book you really want to immerse yourself in. And yes, it's black and white, but there's so much that you can learn. If you want to learn more about street photography, Bystander is the definitive history of street photography, written by Joel Meyerowitz and Colin Westerbeck. They came out with a updated edition of the book several years back. Still available out there, and I highly recommend picking up if you really are invested and interested in street photography and seeing its evolution and how it's practiced not only then but now. It's great. And right now there are deals on it for the book for $35, and it's amazing. So pick it up. And for me, I do a podcast called The Candid Frame. I've been doing it for about 16 years. I have well over 600 episodes in the catalog. And I talk to photographers, not just street photographers, but all kinds of photographers. And we talk about leading a creative life, about the choices that you have to make this what you want to do. Not necessarily as a professional photographer, because I'm not of the thinking that you have to be a professional in order to be able to do this. There are many great photographers who still worked a normal 9 to 5 and made amazing bodies of work. It doesn't necessarily have to be the path for everyone, but I like having dialogues with people who are making the choices to find a way to make photography their own photographic journey, make it work for them. And I'm also on Instagram. You can find me at Ibarionex, so you'll probably see more of my sort of current work there. So that's it for my presentation. I get it out of the screen share here, and I'll answer some questions. You can put them in the chat, and I'll just answer the questions here. Let's see. Got a question from Robert. It says, do you need to get authorization if you want to use the street photograph image for profit or in your portfolio to obtain employment or publication? No, I don't get model releases for the great majority of the work that I do. The only time that you really need model releases is if you're going to be using the work commercially. Like, for example, if Coca-Cola sees one of my pictures and they say, we want to use this for an ad, well, I have to get a model release from whoever was in that photograph in order for me to be able to license that and be able to get paid whatever I'm going to get paid for the use of that image for that advertisement. If I'm publishing that image in a magazine for editorial purposes, if I'm going to be exhibiting the images in an exhibit, whether it's online or in a gallery, I don't need to have model releases. I'm speaking for the United States with respect to that. I've written several books that contain photographs, much of my street photography. I've not needed to get model releases for that because it's largely instructional. And even with my last book, Making Photographs, which you saw earlier, I didn't have to get a model release for the person, for the child in that particular shot, because the publisher didn't ask of it. But there are some certain publishers that if you're using a picture of a person on the cover of your book, they may ask you to get them out of release for the person because that image is being used to market the book. What are your camera settings for street photography in the daytime? I kind of went over that before, but basically, out the door, it's ISO 400, f5.6, shutter speed at least 250th of a second, if not higher. And white balance is usually on auto. I shoot RAW, don't use JPEGs. I'll convert to JPEGs in whatever application that I'm using. Have you ever written books about your photography, and do you have classes in New York? Yes, Making Photographs is the book, the last book that I wrote. My first book was Chasing the Light. Both of them are still available, both as ebooks and as physical books. You can get them through Amazon at this point. It's probably not in the brick and mortar stores, but you can certainly able to get new and used copies that are out there. And if you want a signed copy, I have copies of the last book here that I'd be grateful to sign, and you can just place email me or place an order on my website at thecandidframe.com. This is from Carolyn. Okay, I answered that. From Joseph, how do you approach people to take their photographs? Well, there's a variety of different things. If I'm making a scene in which people are going to walk through, or I'm going to incorporate them as a facet of my composition, I don't ask them. I'm there. I'm making photographs. And if they see me there and they see me sort of composing the scene, they're not thinking that I'm waiting for them to get into the frame. So there's no need for me to sort of approach someone about that. But if I do want to make a street portrait of someone, usually my approach is that I will approach them with a compliment. I will see something about them that I find really interesting. Like, I like your hair, or I like that belt that you're wearing. Where did you get it? Or I love your dog, or something, right? And that usually greases the wheel, because it allows the person to understand why I'm approaching them in the first place. I'm not just going to go up to someone and say, can I make a photograph? Because the first question that pops out of the mouth is, why do I make my photograph? Right? But if I go up there and I approach them with a compliment, usually the reaction to the compliment gives me a clue as to whether or not they might be open to making a photograph. And if they say no, I go, okay, thank you very much. But approaching someone and giving them a compliment is less difficult than approaching someone and making a photograph. Right? It's easier for us to go up and someone and say, hey, I like this about you. Right? And we talked about the fear thing before. It's like, even if you don't make the photograph, if you just go up and just give the person a compliment, that can help you get past the fear of approaching people. That's what I did. I did that for a month. I said, I'm going to go to someone every day and give them a compliment just to get past the fear of approaching someone. And when I saw how positively people responded to a compliment, it became easier to approach them to make a photograph. From Bernard, how can I make the best photography during what I call the forbidden hours, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m.? That's easy. Look for light and shadow. So many of my photographs are made during that period of time, because sometimes that's the only time of day I have to make photographs. I work a 9 to 5. I work at a museum here in Southern California, but even if it's my weekend, sometimes I'm out with my camera, and I'm out when the light, relatively sucks. But I've trained myself to go, okay, where's the shadow? Where's the light? And I'll find a pocket. I'll find a place where there's something happening there, or where there's color, or where there's line, and if the colors are not working, I'll look at it and go, maybe it'll be interesting as sort of a black and white picture, and let me work with that sort of harsh light as a black and white. It's a matter of not looking at it and going, oh, this is terrible light. You never shoot in this kind of light, and then not make the choice to see what potential does exist there. Don't pass judgment on midday light. just because, it's not as good as twilight hour. There are plenty of photographs to be had any time of day and any time of night, for that matter. And in terms of do I ever teach classes in New York? I haven't in a while. I likely will be next year, and there's a possibility that I may be in New York in the fall. I may do something then. So if you want to, you follow me on Instagram, or I have a newsletter that if you go to my website at thecandidframe.com, you can sign up there, and I'll provide updates on that there. Another question from Michael. Do you choose between color or monochrome, black and white, before you take a photo, or make that decision and review the capture after the shooting? I think 80% of the time I'm shooting color. And sometimes I may convert it over to black and white because I'll shoot in color. And as I'm making the photograph, I'll realize that the color is distracting, that it doesn't make it work. And I know in my mind, I'm going to convert this over to black and white. But then there are other times where I'm just going to dedicate the day to just setting my camera for black and white for across on my Fuji, and you just shoot that way. But the great majority of the time, I'm primarily a color photographer, and you saw there's some black and white images there. But for the most part, if an image eventually ends up as black and white, I've imagined it as black and white in the moment, even though I'm shooting it as color, because I know that I'm going to convert it later in Lightroom. Dan, how do you handle people who object and fear you're going to use the picture maliciously? I don't. I really haven't dealt with people. People ask me, why did you make that picture? And I will tell them why. It's like, I love this scene. I loved you in it. I'm completely honest about it. And I'll show them. I'll show them on the LCD, and usually that sort of diffuses it, because people are kind of don't understand why people are pointing a picture in their direction, and they get confused, right? And if I am going to engage, I'm going to say, "Hey, I'm a photographer. I do this," and then and usually leads into a conversation. I may pull up my Instagram feed and I'll show them. And if they're interested, if they like the picture, I say, give me your Instagram, and I'll just tag you when I post it. I used to get the people's email, give my email address to people and say, hey, just email me and I'll send you a copy. No one ever, I think once or twice, people would get back to me. Most people don't care. They just want to have an understanding of why you're doing it. And as long as you're honest and sincere, don't take a picture and then act like you didn't take the picture. That raises a bunch of red flags. You're not doing anything wrong. I'm not doing anything wrong. This is Monica. How have your street photography pictures changed over time? Whew, man. Yeah, I could spend an hour talking about that. I've just evolved. Like I said before, I will practice a certain thing that I'm trying to get good at. I'll do it over and over and over again, like this playing with light and shadow. I did it over and over and over again, trying to sort of refine the way that I saw it. And I got good at that. And then I said, okay, I got that down. What else do I want to strive for? And for example, layered photographs along the lines of what Alex Webb has done. Beautiful. Just his sense of layering is just fantastic. His awareness of foreground, middle ground, and background. And interesting thing about that is I really tried. I was trying, really getting really frustrated, and eventually I just had to sort of give up trying to make it happen. And then slowly I discovered that I was seeing images in that way, but I had to sort of let go of this absolute, fever to try and make it happen, and slowly I was able to look at scenes and sort of build that. So it's always sort of an evolution. I strive for something, and then it's about, okay, I've learned it, I've refined it. Okay, what next? what next. So I'm always aspiring. I'm not simply, you know, resting on my laurels. So, if you take a look at my photographs over the years, even on my Instagram feed, you can see how things are changing. I don't have a singular style. People say they look at my photographs and they know it's me, which I take as a great compliment. But if you were to ask me what my style was, I have no bloody idea. Dwayne, how do you turn your passion for street photography into profit? You don't. I don't make money from my street photography per se, but the skills that I've developed as a street photographer, my skill to be able to observe light, to observe moment, to be completely immersed in a scene, to see the subtle changes, to be able to respond quickly on my feet. All the things that I've learned in my street photography apply to everything else that I do. So all the commercial work that I've done, all the editorial work that I've done, the portraiture work that I've done, that skill set that I've developed on the street, I apply to every other kind of photography that I do that actually does earn me money. Because I think street photography is the most difficult kind of photography to do. And if you can do it well, I think you can do everything else. So, let's see. Okay, I got a long question here. How do you stay inspired and keep generating new ideas? How do you keep it fresh? How do you approach photography as an artistic practice versus straightforward documentary photography? There's a lot here. Are there ethical concerns or lines you won't cross as a street photographer? Where do you draw the line on privacy, ethical concerns? Okay. In terms of ethical, there's no kind of photograph that I won't make, right? If I'm feeling like moved to make a photograph, I'm not going to make a photograph that I feel is detrimental or is diminishing of anyone that's in the scene. So I am not out to do that. I am trying to pull beauty from what I'm seeing. So I come from a sort of really genuine place. I'm careful about photographing pictures of kids, but you can see that there are pictures of kids there. I don't. That's not my go-to, but there are certain scenes where it's like I have to make this photograph, and I will make the photograph. And then if the parents are there and they need to engage with me, that's not an issue. But I come from a very respectful place in terms of the people that are around me. I love my subjects, even if I don't know them, and I think that's the attitude that I take when I'm walking down the streets, and I think it helps me in terms of my attitude. I don't feel like I'm taking anything from anybody, right? I don't think I'm doing anything wrong when I'm out there making photographs. I'm not trying to do anything wrong. I'm not trying to do anything illegal, And when people see my photographs, one of the most satisfying responses I get is that, God, I never saw that. I walked past that thousands of times and I never saw it the way that you did. It's that affirming, that self-affirming thing that I talked about earlier. Gary, are you encountering a large increase in people refusing to be photographed, and are you using any type of consent form or permission form? In terms, in terms of model releases, those forms, no, I don't carry them around. There's some stuff that I do for Fuji that, because they're going to be used commercially, I do have to get model releases for. So if I'm doing something and I'm purposely producing images for Fuji, yes, in that case, I have to have model releases because they're using it commercially. But for my own personal use, I don't have to do that. But I've not noticed an increase in terms of people's resistance to being photographed. There's an increased awareness of the presence of cameras, because everybody has a cell phone camera. But when you bring out what, quote unquote, a real camera, people are a little more curious about sort of what you're doing. But be quite honest, most people do not care. Most people are just out there sort of doing their business, living their lives. People will look at me and going, what the hell is he doing? But they'll just keep moving. So I'm not seeing it. I think photographers thinking about it more, but I don't think that en masse is what's happening out there. Gary, are you encountering? I have to answer that. Bill, some people feel that street photography in its pure state is black and white. How do you feel? Well, if that's the way you feel, that's the way you feel. You know, if you know, some people could be absolute purists and go, it's only street photography if you're using a Leica. If you're only using it on film. It's only street photography if you're shooting it outside on the street, not inside in a bar. There are exceptions to every absolute that you will hear with respect to street photography. And I can give you an example of an exceptional photograph that violates this absolute concept that it's only great black and white. I'm not hanging around people who give me those kinds of absolutes. No, I'm sorry. My life is too short to say that there's only certain ways that you can do this thing. That's the wonderful thing about street photography. If you do this long enough, you will find what works for you. You're the way that you need to approach it in order to make your pictures. And it's going to be different from, the other person in your camera club. It's going to be different from that person who's published 7 books. But if it leads you to make the photographs that you are driven to make, that's all that freaking matters. That's it. And if someone wants to say, oh, that's not real street photography, what I want to say, but I don't always say, is, okay, let me look at your pictures. Let me see if this is a discussion that's really worth having with you. And more often than not, I never see the pictures, because it's, don't get caught up in all that garbage. Just go out and spend time and make your pictures. Okay, I'll take this last one here. I have been told it's only street photography if it's shot at 35 millimeter. That's crazy. Okay, so everything that was created by Henri Cartier-Bresson, who used 28 millimeter, we're gonna throw that in the ash can because it wasn't shot with a 35 millimeter lens. Or Robert Frank, who shot a bunch of stuff with a 50. They didn't exclusively use those focal lengths, but there's God, there's a photographer I've interviewed a couple of times who shot Coney Island. He uses a 28 exclusively. I think it's a 24 or 28. And my God, that work is fantastic. He's been photographing Coney Island for I think 40, 50 years. The 28 with his Leica. You're going to tell me that's not street photography? Again, it's kind of like the argument about, it's just black and white. And it's whatever you need it to be. Bottom line. Just go out and make your photographs. Go out and challenge yourself. Make yourself better. That's it. That's all that matters. Go out and make your damn pictures. And as I've said, get out of your own way, whether it is being preoccupied with gear, whether it is letting fear get the better of you. Go out and make the photographs. You're not going to think yourself in becoming a better photographer. You're only going to make yourself a better photographer by actively seeing, practicing, and rinse and repeat. Go out there and make your pictures. So that's it. I went a little longer than I expected, but I hope that you all enjoyed the presentation. And again, if you want to find out more about me, you can visit thecandidframe.com or follow me on Instagram. And see you soon. Thanks again to you, Adorama, and Fujifilm for making all this happen. Take care and have a great weekend.